Reuben and Simeon, but I'm going to kind of back up and get a running start because we're closing out. I'm probably going to go and I'll just start there and not backtrack too much into the prior chapters. One of the things that's happening is we're closing out the book of Genesis. And as we said here, maybe last week or week before last, what we had extrapolated out to be based on the book of Luke, it should have took about 10 years to go through. But so far we're 2.5 years into it, so here in the next couple of weeks we'll be closing out. We're going to roll right over into Exodus chapter 1 verse 1. So we're going to go and continue on with the study into the book of Exodus. I think you're going to find Exodus chapter 1 quite interesting because it's going to cover about 135 to 150 years of history pertaining to the children of Israel while they're in Egypt and some of the events that's going to befall them. So anyway, we're here in Genesis 49, and what's happening is Jacob is near death. He's gotten old, and now he has called his sons together to give them blessings and prophecy. And when you look at what's going on here and you look at the future events that was going to transpire with these sons, it seems this was more prophecy than it is blessing. The blessing, of course, the ultimate blessing to them was inheriting the promised land and going there and being established in that land. But we're going to find there's some other things here and events in their lives. So here we find that Jacob tells them in chapter 49 and verse 1, he called unto his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." And so, as we look at this, Jacob's days are coming to an eye. And of course, we know that the events that's going to happen here, they're going to be in a captivity in Egypt. They're going to come out under the guidance of Moses and be established there in the promised land. So that's the last days, if you will, that it's talking about there is the events that's going to transpire to get them there. So we find that these things are going to happen. We know out of these sons that he's already adopted, if you will, the two sons of Joseph. And we talked about that last week, about Ephraim and Manasseh being adopted in. And as we talked a lot about this, we talked about how Joseph is a type of Christ. And we went through about, Brother Gaddis Roy had about 14 bullet points in his book, Types and Shadows. And then we come across in a commentary, and we read most of them off, about 50 points that show how this is a shadow and type of things to come. And so we're going to kind of continue that thought today when we get into the blessings and cursings of these children, or the prophecy and blessings unto the children of Israel. And so we find in chapter 2, "Gather yourselves together, and hear ye, sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father." So now we have Jacob realizing and acknowledging that he is both. He is also Jacob as far as the flesh is concerned, but if you will, and we'll use a type of spirituality here about being Israel. So it's through his sons that these things are going to take place. Primarily, as the Bible continues to unfold, you'll see references back to these sons, but primarily it's going to deal with the tribe of Judah, isn't it? Through which Christ is going to come. The others are going to play a very important role, and we talked about that, about the Bible primarily focusing on the lineage of Jesus Christ, but you have all these other people that's involved. The supporting cast, as we liken it unto. It's kind of like a play or a movie. You'll have 4 or 5 primary players that make up the primary part of the show, if you will, but then when you look at the supporting cast, there's a lot of folks that make it work, And so kind of liking it unto that is what we're seeing here. Even though the promise they were instrumental in helping get it here, is what I'm trying to say. By what they provided to Israel as a whole from each tribe. One of the things that he starts off with Reuben. And the reason he starts off with Reuben is because by all rights and probability, Reuben should have received the primary part of the inheritance because he was the oldest. But that didn't happen. We're going to find that because of what Reuben had done, he canceled out or made his inheritance null and void. We're going to find that true with Simeon. We're going to find that true with Levi. And we're going to find Judah is the primary one that's going to receive the blessings of Jacob through which Christ Jesus is going to come. Notice what's said about Reuben. Verse 3, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might and beginning of my strength, the excellence of dignity and the excellency of power. But you're unstable as water. Okay? Thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defilest thou it, and he went up to my couch. So we find that Jacob recognizes Reuben has been an important part of his life. You know, he recognized him as far as from the point of strength, as he says here, and dignity of power. But the thing is, you may have all these good attributes, but you don't know how to use them. That's what he's getting at. Okay? He had good attributes, but he wound up squandering the talent that he had because of sin. And notice what his daddy says unto him here, you're unstable as water. Daniel, back then they didn't have electricity. So, you know, we make the statement today that, you know, electricity takes the path of least resistance, right? And it does, okay? Water is the same way. If you pour water out on the ground and it begins to run, if it comes to a leaf or a branch, what will it do? It'll stop right there and begin to puddle up, and then it'll go around that obstacle, okay? So he's likened Reuben to that. You've got some excellent qualities, but you're so unstable, you know? And one of the things that this is telling us too is that one of the things that the Bible looks at, it does look at good characteristics and good traits, but what it's teaching us here, you can have these characteristics and good traits, but you don't know how to use them because you're so unstable. God wants these characteristics and traits in us, but what we're going to see is He wants stability too. You've got to be stable. You can't be flighty, if you will. Here, there, yonder, and all over the place. So that's the way Reuben was. And so we find he tells Reuben that because of what happened there in Genesis chapter 35 and verse 22, where he committed immorality with his father concubine Bilhah, is the sin he's referring to there. And so, you know, we talked about that in great lengths back over there about him committing that sin. And you know, we find also that Reuben, because of his instability, the birthright was divided. You know, the firstborn was usually the spiritual and social leader, as we said, but with Reuben, that's not going to be so. And so through this, you know, we can see that God is starting to decentralize, if you will, having one head of household over many different aspects of the tribes. We're going to find that each tribe had its own head, if you will, and that it was decentralized and not focused on one individual. Types and shadows, you kind of see God decentralizing the role of religion in a sense here, meaning each tribe was autonomous unto itself. You know, kind of you see a picture of their church coming into being here and how the church was going to be structured. That each congregation, even though it's one complete body, each congregation is its own head and rulership. And so we begin to see a picture of this starting to take place. We find that when he said that the tribe of Reuben would not excel, what we find is no prophet or judge or king that we know of ever came from the tribe of Reuben. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? No tribe, judge, or king ever came from the tribe of Reuben. One of the things that this shows too, and this may give an explanation of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 30. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. He had all the attributes and qualities to be a leader in God's kingdom, but he failed because of sin and instability. So his tribe wound up not excelling, even though they should have, but they didn't. We're going to move on down now in verse 5. It talks about Simeon, and it talks about Levi, our brethren, but they're instruments of cruelty in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, my honor, be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And so we find the prophecy concerning Simeon and Levi, the blessing and the curse, if you will, concerning them. And he talked about them being instruments of cruelty. And we're going to find that that was true about the life of the tribe of Simeon and of Levi. And remember what he's talking about here about them being instruments of cruelty took place in Genesis chapter 34, verses 25 through 29. And it had to do with the misuse and abuse of their sister, Dinah. And of course, they took out strong retaliation in Shechem against those that had committed that. So we find that when they did this, that kind of canceled them out as far as being a part of the promise. They were the second and third born. But because of this, they were canceled out. They got angry and done this and it did not please God the way they done it, the way they handled it, and we won't go back and go through all that because we spent some time on that about how they taught the king there and the people, the men there, into being circumcised, and when they were circumcised and they were down for that period of time, they went in and slew all of them. So we find them being instruments of cruelty. Their anger was rooted in self-will, and so when it says being hamstrung as an ox, that's what an ox is. An ox is just strictly self-willed. It's kind of like an old bull like the pasture. You can pretty much figure he do what he want to do, and if he's big enough, he go where he want to go. His boundary is not intact, is it? And so that's the way it was viewed by Simeon and Levi. One thing too that we see in this, that even though our sins may be forgiven by God, the sins that were committed in the past can come back to haunt us. And it did then. That's a strong illustration of that the sins of our past can come back to even haunt us. Even when forgiven, they carry consequences we must face for a lifetime. And we may have experienced that in life, where events and things that have transpired and all, and God may be forgiving us, and we may be on the right path, doing all the right things, but you still got this back here to deal with. The sins of the past, they haunt us. A lot of times, if you want to look at it in an upper level structure situation, a person goes out and commits a crime, and maybe it's a very bad crime, and they have to go to prison, but somewhere in prison they obey the gospel. Well, and they get on the right path, okay? But yet, just because they obey the gospel does not cancel out the debt that they owe to society. They still have to pay for the sins they committed back then. And that's the way life is a lot of times. We can think about events probably in our life where it transpired and all like that, and then, later on begin to realize the error of our way, and we obeyed the gospel and started on the right path and intend on staying on the right path. But then you got these things back here that tendency to crop up every once in a while. So this is what happened to Simeon and Levi. The sins of the past were still there haunting them. So it's something to be considerate of as we go through life about when you stop and think for a minute how we act instead of react maybe a lot of times. Because that reacting can get us in trouble, you know. We don't stop and think about the long-term consequences of it. The Bible, you know, does speak about, godly anger, doesn't it? You know, we know Jesus had godly anger when he cleansed out the temple, didn't he? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, be angry and do not sin. So we find there's anger that's rooted in righteousness. You know, when we look at emotions that's put into people, we kind of have to go back to the creation. And we look at those emotions and you see that these emotions that was put in us were emotions that are good emotions that were put in us by God, because there's no evil in God's eyes. There's no evil in God's creation. So what is it about these emotions? What is it about anger? Be angry and sin not. The Bible also tells us that let all bitterness, wrath, anger be put away from you in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31. And yet we find that emotion exists. So what is that about? Well, that emotion is like a lot of emotions that's put in us. It was an emotion put in us to make us act, to make us move. God knew that when he created man, that within his creation, that man would have a tendency to get complacent, to get laxed. That emotion was put in there to stir us up to action, to move, to get going, to get started, you know? So where does it become sin? Well, you know, we've got to remember, and we repeated this several times throughout this lesson, what you have to remember in all this, there is another influence at work here. That is the influence of the devil. It's at work here, okay? So he takes that good emotion and he uses it to stir us up into unrighteous anger, envy, lust, malice, hatred, bitterness. So he takes that emotion of the heart, if you will, and he turns it around. And he uses it against us to try to defeat the purpose of God. It's kind of like the emotion of fear, a good emotion that God put into us at the creation. What about that emotion of fear? Well, God put fear in man to preserve life. That's what it's about. So we wouldn't do something stupid. If we didn't have that fear in us and that knowledge of fear in us, and we're out and we walk up to a cliff, what would keep us from stopping? The fear of falling out, wouldn't it? So where did that emotion come from? It came from God. Or I-65's out here, Eric, and we're walking out there toward I-65, and you got all these 18-wheelers coming. If we didn't know the fear of the emotion of fear, we'd just keep walking right on out there, and Jeff, guess what will happen? You see? To preserve life. But what does the devil do with you? Before I go there, fear God and keep his commandments. That's why it was put there, wasn't it? All reverence and respect is what he's talking about there. Okay? But what does the devil do with fear? Well, I kind of paint a picture like you see in the cartoon sometimes. He's sitting up here on his shoulder, whispered in your ear, you better not speak up about the church, they'll laugh at you. You better not talk about baptism because you're going to create a problem. That goes against the doctrines of the Word. So what does the devil do? He's taking fear, a good emotion, and he's turning it around for it to act against the will of God. That may seem kind of deep, but when you look at this, this is actually what's going on. Okay? You got the influence of the devil still being shown in the lives of these people, but what God is doing is saying, irregardless of that, my will is going to be done. So far, the influence of the devil did not prevent 8 souls being saved by water, did it? It did not prevent God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and his promises keep marching on, did he? He's trying. He's trying real hard, He's trying everything in the book to try to stop this, but so far he hasn't been able to stop it, even though man falls to his influence, doesn't he? Man falls to his influence. Does that stop the purpose and will of God? No. It's going on. It's still going on today, as a matter of fact. And we find that when it talked about them being divided among Jacob, the tribe of Simeon was the weakest numerically of the 12 tribes. Numbers chapter 26 and verse 14. And they shared an allotment of land with Judah in Joshua chapter 19 and verse 1. So we're going to find that these things are going to come about pertaining to Simeon and Levi. And we know when they first started out, the tribe of Simeon became actually small during the wilderness wandering. When they started out from Egypt, they were the third largest tribe in Numbers chapter 1 and verse 23. And at the second wilderness census that took place of Israel, 63% of the tribe perished, and they became the smallest tribe, Numbers 26 and verse 14. So this is what's going to happen to them. And the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Levi formerly did not receive an inheritance, did they? They were scattered among the other tribe. Out of this came the priesthood, didn't it? Through the tribe of Levi became it. What happened is, because of the faithfulness of this tribe during the rebellion of the golden calf, Exodus chapter 32, verses 26 to 28, it was scattered as a blessing throughout the whole nation of Israel. They received no large tract of land, for the Lord was their inheritance, and not the land. Joshua 13:33. So, we find that they did get on a good path, didn't they? They sure did. At one time, was there problems, and was it problematic? Yeah. Jacob himself was problematic, wasn't he? Yeah. We'll go back and look. Abraham was problematic, wasn't he? It took a while to get all this to happen. This didn't happen overnight. It still amazes me, Brother Con, that it took Abraham 50 years after he left the earth to come to the point where he could sacrifice Isaac. That's a lifetime, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does it ever quit growing? No. It's a continuous operation, isn't it? From one point to another point. It's a step by step. Did these people make mistakes along the way? They sure did. They sure did. It's one thing to make a mistake and fall and let the mistake overwhelm you and carry you away. But it's another thing to make a mistake and get up, put it behind you, and go forward. That's where the true test lies in. We're all going to fall. We're all going to fail. Well, what did we do? One thing about it, they stayed faithful to their father, didn't they? And they did stay faithful to who they were and to the promise that Abraham had made to Isaac, didn't they? But they had failures, didn't they?
They had a deep belief in God.
They did.
Deep belief.
Right.
And it counted to him for righteousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Joe did.
Well, because of righteousness, because later on the Apostle Paul said in the New Testament that there is none righteous, no, not one. Not even one that doeth good and sinneth not.
Right.
So that means God included them all under sin so that he might have mercy on them.
Mercy. That's right. And so when you look at Simeon and Levi, they were scattered just as Jacob told them.
Oh, yeah.
But Levi was going to become a blessing in the scattering, and Simeon was going to become a curse. And so we find that these things were going to, and like I say, in the opening remarks with this, when you look at it, we look at it more from the blessing side, but is it more of a prophecy than maybe blessings? Maybe a little bit of both, what was going to befall them and things like that. So anyway, we're now down to the tribe of Judah. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. And here within this, we're going to see prophecy concerning Jesus Christ. Okay? The coming of Shiloh. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey, my son. Thou art gone up, he stooped down, he crouched as a lion. And as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter or the ruler's staff shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Binding is his fold unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, his teeth white with milk. And so we find here, as we look at the big picture of this, we see a type of antitype of Christ to come within this. And I'm having to rely heavily upon notes this morning, because when you're dealing with these children and these promises, and there's so much of it, it's kind of like we were talking about kin folks earlier. A lot of these folks, you know, they have big families and it branches out. It's just hard to keep up with, isn't it? Now what's going on with them, so I'm having to rely heavily. And I have condensed it a lot too, going on in here, so we can cover some of it in time. It's really a study within itself about how all this came about and how it all meshes together. You know, we find that Judah was not a totally exemplary character himself, was he? He was not above reproach. He was not above sin. If you remember about Judah, you know, he was the one that suggested a profit motive to get rid of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 38. And we know he didn't deal faithfully with his daughter-in-law Tamar in Genesis 38:26 like he was supposed to. And later on, he thought that she was a prostitute, and that came about in Genesis 38:18. But one of the things you see in Judah, you begin to see the turn. Remember when we're talking about the testing and trials these brothers underwent before Joseph to see if their nature and their attitude and their character had started to change from what they were. Well, the defining point really for Judah was when Benjamin, the younger, was held back by Joseph to go, and the rest of them were to go to their father. What did Judah speak up and do? Judah was the one that suggested we sell Joseph, you know, to the Ishmael and make a profit off of him, you know. Well, now, you know, because of the way Benjamin was, and we talked about the structure of the family and how Benjamin became the favored son, that was done as a trial to see if the brothers were going to actually leave him there in captivity, like they did Joseph. And we talked about that quite extensively. And so we find that it was Judah in Genesis chapter 44 that stood up and said, "Do not keep the younger. Let me stay in his stead, because my father will surely die." That's a big switch, wasn't it? From the attitude he displaced before until the attitude that he's displacing now. Let me be the substitute. Let me take his place. And so we find overall this blessing and examples of the richness of God's grace to the undeserving. And so we find that Judah now, like I say, he's going to become the one through which the promised seed will come, through the seed of Leah. He was going to be great amongst his brethren from that standpoint. It talked about unto Shiloh come. The leadership prophecy took some 640 years to be fulfilled, in part with the reign of David, the first of the Judah's dynasty of kings. The prophecy took some 600 years to complete, fulfill in Jesus, and Jesus being referred to as Shiloh, as we know. The name amongst the name that means he whose right it is, or to whom it belongs, and a title anciently understood to speak of the Messiah. So we're going to find that this prophecy came true, that from David to the Herods, a prince of Judah was head over Israel even in Daniel's captivity. So we can see that Judah was going to be the one, the primary. One of the things you find out that the Jews, they liken it to this until Shiloh comes and the ruling rod will not depart from Judah. When the Roman rulers began to take over and begin to pull the religious rights that the Jews had away from them, the Jewish rabbis, it said, would walk through the streets of Jerusalem. Some historians say Jesus was already there. He was probably about 12 or 13 years old. But they were walking through the streets of Jerusalem, and they would require, woe unto us, for the ruler's rod has been taken away from Judah, and Shiloh has not come. So, they had this thought pattern that they were still looking for the earthly rulership, wasn't they? They just couldn't see it. They felt like under Roman rule that all that had been taken away, that the prophecy pertaining to Judah had to come null and void, is what they're saying. But it hadn't, had it? They just couldn't interpret the scriptures, could they? Their scriptures, They just couldn't see who Jesus Christ was. And we're going to find that Judah's land was a great prosperous country. It was a great prosperous wine country and things of that nature. So these things are going to come true. The rabbis were wrong. And I'm going to pause for just a second because I've been talking down into nothing. Any of you brethren have anything you want to add to that? Or any thoughts or anything?
I was reading on the Simeon and Levi, how when they committed that sin, you were talking about this a while ago. Have you ever thought, and I forgot where I read that, but it was thoughts in there that maybe Simeon was held back and Simeon and Levi were separated when they came to Joseph because of what they had done prior.
Well, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was that could be a part of it because the sin they had committed, it wasn't null and void, was it? Even though the act of forgiveness is being involved in it, that sin still carried consequences, didn't it? You still had that sin to deal with. It didn't go away. It's kind of like a lot of things. We might want it to go away, but in the past, what's done is done.
Still going to reaping and sowing. Sowing and reaping.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. Reaping and sowing. Yeah, reaping and sowing. Yeah, and that's what it is. That's a good point here. Where am I at? Verse 13. Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be a haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zion, Sidon. And so we find here he's talking about the Zebulian. Joseph, if you notice there, has skipped some sons in the birth order, moving to the 10th and 9th sons, but he's keeping his focus on those born of Leah. Okay, of Leah. And it's kind of interesting about that after all this time and everything that the realization and recognition of Leah is finally coming about it. After all these years, and after all the things he's gone through, and after all the pining over Rachel and all these things, he's finally realizing that she is going to be the one of the importance in it. The last shall be first. There's another prime example of that, isn't it, that he talks about.
Through his progression of age, through Jacob's progression of age,
Yeah.
he's probably realized that this was God's plan.
Right. Yeah. And and you can see in his life a lot of times, he felt like that God had forsaken him, Why is this happening to me? Why are these boys like this? Why are they giving me all this trouble, I think we talked about, it seemed like every time he would send them off, they'd come back one short. Look at Joseph, went to Dothan to find them, they come home one short. They go down to Egypt, They come back home, they won short. What are they boys doing? You know? But anyway, we find it was all in God's plan, as Jeff said. One of the things that is noted about Zebulun was he's noted for faithfulness to David, supplying the largest number of soldiers to David's army of any single tribe. And we find in 1 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 33 that these soldiers were experts in battle, stout-hearted men who could keep the ranks. So we're going to see that, as we said before, these men had a role in what was to come. This is a supporting cast to make this happen, okay? Just like with the tribe of Zebulun and all the soldiers they supplied, 50,000 of them went out to battle, and they were all experts in weapons of war. That's who they became. And that's why the prophecy about them is what it is. The tribe of Zebulun seemed to have settled in the piece of land sitting between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So they were pretty stout-hearted people. So they, looks like they literally dwell by the sea, that part of God's plan and God's promise. Let me bring that first. Sometimes I'm going to encourage you to take chapter 49 and go back and do a little more in-depth study than what we can do here. You're going to find that I've condensed us a lot. There's a whole lot more that's going on here than what we can cover. We could probably spend weeks and take each tribe and just break it out, go through the Old Testament and see what role they actually played in all this and how they were hardwired into all this. So, but we're just doing a general overview of it. So, Issachar. Where are you at, Issachar? Okay, Issachar. Issachar is a strong ass crouching down between two birds. And he saw that rest was good and the land that it was pleasant. And he bowed his shoulders to bear and became a servant unto tribute. So here we have Issachar now receiving a prophecy, a blessing, if you will, from Jacob. And it talks about Issachar being a strong donkey. And what we find about them, they were a large tribe. They were the third largest tribe according to Numbers 26 when the census was taken. So they became a large tribe. But because of their size and abundance, they were very often the target of other countries coming in and taking them off into slavery. And that's what it's talking about here as it talked about them being strong and crouching down, and they became a servant under tribute. So we're going to find that this meaning seems to be that Issachar was strong, but it seems like they were kind of docile and lazy. He would enjoy the good land assigned to him, but would never strive for it. Therefore, he would be pressed into servitude, the mere bearing of burdens for his master. So this is what's going to become of the tribe of Issachar. They were a strong tribe. They were a big tribe, but it seems like they just kind of lived off the fat of the land, were fat, half, and sassy, and they didn't have too much motivation to defend it. So that's what's going to become of them. They're going to become a tribe that was targeted for those who take them out into servitude. We now get down to Dan. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse's heel, so that his rider shall fall backwards. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. And so now we get down to Dan. And we find that Dan is another one of those tribes that supplied a lot of soldiers unto the kings, but also there was a very prominent judge that came out of Dan, and that is Samson in Judges 13:2.
I just have a question, kind of going back to Issachar. Who is, or what tribe was the lost tribe of Israel?
That's a very good question.
That kind of of sounds like Ishikar.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. I don't have an answer for that one. Generally, collectively, we usually think of the 10 tribes eventually being lost because of the captivity and stuff like that. Could this be a reference to Ishikar? It's a good point. Don't know. Let's look at that. I'll look at that and we'll see what we can find out about it, about them being a tribe that was lost. How about that? Okay, very good. Let's see. Dan, we talked about he was going to judge his people. They supplied the most prominent of the judges, Samson in Judges chapter 13 and verse. But Dan was a troublesome tribe, we're going to find. Just as it said here, they're like a serpent. A serpent is very troublesome, isn't it? We're going to find it's going to be Dan that introduced idolatry into Israel in Judges 18:30. Jeroboam set up one of his idolatrous golden calves in Dan, 1 Kings 12:26-30. And later Dan became a center of idol worship in Egypt, Amos chapter 8:14. And so we find that that was going to be the prophecy about Dan. We're going to find that the Hebrew word for salvation, he talks about here, but waiting for your salvation, is Yeshua. And at this point of prophecy, when Jacob was near death, he called out for God's salvation, not knowing that in the end he was calling out to Jesus. Brother Con, you had your...
I was going to make a comment about Dan. I read it somewhere, maybe long years ago, when it was in some historian had traced it back from way back, and it said wherever Dan went in his territory that he always left a mark. And so it became known as Denmark, and now it is the country we know as Denmark now.
Huh.
It
How about
changed the
that?
reading from Dan to Den.
Uh-huh.
And so it was kind of interesting to me that wherever he went, he always left a mark.
Worth the mark. Well, how about that? That's something I've
A mark
had
of
come across.
identifying mark.
Identifying mark. Okay, that's something I had come across. That's kind of interesting, curious. So.
Well, these historians, they dig deep and they trace way back. You know, I don't know where it was Josephus, who it was I read it from, but anyway, I did read it. I can very well remember reading it.
Right. Okay. We'll stop right here and we'll pick up with Gad next week. And we'll get ready for the worship service.
I didn't say it, but I know that all the descendants of France is from Reuben. I know that.
From Reuben?
Yeah. In the United States and Great Britain is descendants from Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah. I had read that. I've got some literature on that. I don't know that.
already knew that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, that's one of them kind I had to study and look at. I don't know that I totally buy in on what they say about that one now, about some of them. But that is the thoughts out there on that, just like you said. I've actually got some literature and paperwork on it that, for these people that went back through that like that. But I don't know about that one. I'll have to kind of...
Well, it all originated over there when they came into the borders out of Europe and came into where Great Britain is known as Great Britain is known as England, known as United Kingdom. It's got different names, you know.
Yeah.
But it's all one and the same place.
I know that, like I say, I've read some of that, and I know that there's some literature published on that, I think in 1832. But I don't know about that.
Back World War II, when I was in Europe over there, they kept any reference made to Great Britain, you know, as the Royal Air Force, mainly RAF,
Right.
and the United Kingdom. They called it the
United Kingdom, yeah.
I guess because it was, at that time, it was very patriotic.
Right,
It was well united.
yeah.
And that's what we're supposed to be now, as the United States, but we ain't what we ought to be.
No, we're a long way from it, are we?
We're a long ways from being what we ought to be now.
Hey, hey, we're gonna take
They won't reset it anymore. Quiet, he goes all the way to the ceiling.